commercialization of agriculture. Again, we will try to find out the definition. We'll learn about the causes or the platform behind commercialization of agriculture. Hereby, we'll look into the different phases or the purpose behind commercialization of agriculture. And we'll learn about the significance or impact. That means a critical examination of commercialization of agriculture. That means the positive consequences plus the negative impact. This is how our lecture is going to be. Please write it down. We'll move on forward. We'll learn about the definition. When we use the term commercialization of agriculture, it should be understood in contrast to subsistence farming. Subsistence farming. What is subsistence farming? I'll explain that first. Subsistence means it is small scale. It is to meet basic requirements. What are the basic requirements? Payment of revenue, meet expenses, and also personal consumption. Very logically, there is a thematic approach. Nakshatra, you have a lot of requirements. This is what we mean by subsistence farming. What is after meat? Meat expenses, purchase clothes, basic requirements that come under it. Meat expenses and personal consumption. That means subsistence mostly for the production of food. Production of food grains. Mostly production of food grains. We'll come back to commercialization of agriculture. I hope you understand subsistence. This will help you understand commercialization of agriculture. I will dictate. Write down. Commercialization of agriculture. In short, we'll be using it a lot. Write COA. Commercialization of agriculture refers to the phenomenon of production of crops. What kind of crops? We'll know. Production of crops for the purpose of selling in the market. Next point. Generally, commercialization of agriculture involves extensive farming. It means large scale production, and primary consideration is driven by the market. Primary consideration is determined by the market or driven by the market. Extensive farming, that means large scale production, and primary consideration is determined by the market. To have further clarity, under the ambit, what are the scope of commercialization of agriculture? That can include food crop. I hope you understand food crop. That means rice, wheat, sorghum, barley, oil seeds, etc. There can be another categorization is plantation agriculture. There are different types all under the scope of commercialization of agriculture. Plantation agriculture, this will include tea, coffee, sugarcane. Also certain cash crops, namely cotton, indigo. Opium can also be in the list. Done? I believe this is what you're looking for. These diagrams often will help you have conceptual clarity. Tell me, do you understand commercialization of agriculture? You grow food or crops for the requirement of the market. That means here when I say market, for the British needs. Let us understand the causes or the platform. That means the steps towards commercialization of agriculture, right? The more you acclimatize to this model, it will give you effective understanding for your prelims. There are several types of your prelims questions. One particular pattern is technical terms. Right now, they are getting more technical and subjective. Conceptual clarities are more required for answering questions for your prelims. This will help you in the right direction. Next is, we'll learn about the causes or the platform behind commercialization of agriculture. Here, we will be looking into the phases of commercialization of agriculture as well. Basically, commercialization of agriculture, the first stage is by the Charter Act of, I'll rather dictate. You might be finding it difficult. No problem. Write down. The commercialization of agriculture started in India under the provisions of Charter Act of 1833, under which European private citizen were entitled to purchase immovable property in India. Here, when I say immovable property, I am pointing towards land. You can carry on with the sentence. You can make a next point. Write down. This particularly coincided with the British Industrial Revolution. Right? How so? Let us explain. We will explain this term. Suppose British Industrial Revolution, you can write it, scribble. You can also make notes by yourself. It is your call. The British Industrial Revolution happened in the textile sector, right? And when we say textile sector, it is cotton finished goods. That was the output. For this, they needed raw material, that is particularly raw cotton, and dye, that is indigo. For these, the British neither had the space, that means land, to cultivate, nor the conducive climate. Thereby, naturally, they depended on India for these requirements. That is the rationale behind commercialization of agriculture. If I give you the details about the story, suppose Indigo. Indigo needs, how to explain this? Suppose Britain, they already had established a number of factories. Britain is a small space of land, small space. Thereby, they have already paucity of land. Thereby, they cannot do agriculture. It reaches a saturation point, right? They can either cultivate or they can industrialize. There is more profit in industries. Thereby, naturally, you would want to industrialize. The second is that suppose you want to cultivate indigo in the particular Eastern Indian climate, that is the only conducive one. In European climate, that is why since time immemorial, they had to depend on the dyes from India. The Mediterranean climate, the European climate produces similar kind of dye, but a very substandard one. The Mediterranean climate produces very substandard dye. Also for indigo, cotton, the climate of Britain will not permit the cultivation of cotton. In India also, the Deccan Plateau is the ideal spot for cultivation of indigo. All right, next point, please carry on. Next point, also as the factories took a lot of space, land available for agriculture got reduced. Thereby, Britain also started depending on India for the requirement of food. I hope you understood this point as well. There is no land available. They have to grow food in India. Also, you have to understand the socio-economic practices, the food practices all changed because of British industrial level. You can understand that some food will become very, very important because of its natural quality of generating more energy. The workers needed basically the concept of time, the concept of electricity, all they were the outcome of industrial revolution. That means what? They needed more time to work. Conventionally, time for work was from sunrise to sunset. Now they wanted more time in the evening and later on period. Also, it was the period of enlightenment. Some food, for example, tea, coffee, tobacco, sugarcane, they were known as food for intellectuals. Today we know tobacco is for cancer. But yes, in that period, it became very, very popular. So that also could be cultivated in India. India was known for cultivation of tea. And without sugar, tea is meaningless, right? So thereby also you can interlink this point. Understood? Next point. Please, tobacco was abolished by Jahangir. What will you do with this information? But yes, the Mughals were skeptical about the tobacco. Tobacco is originating from, again, not India. It was introduced by the Portuguese. The Mughals preferred cannabis and not tobacco, if you are going in that direction. Anyways, get back to our lecture. Next point. The British also wanted to manage the balance of payment crisis with China. For this purpose, opium was cultivated in India. Opium, some of you might be knowing in the name of posta, right? Some say probably khaskhas, right? Poppy seeds. And the extracts of the poppy is afim, right? Again, the component is morphine that has a hallucinating effect. Under the category of opiate narcotics. It was used by, for addiction purposes. Again, you have to understand that for China, China used to sell but not purchase. It was only for, Sujal is saying, cultivated in my district. It was cultivated mostly in central provinces. Today also in portions of Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, portions of West Bengal. They are also a part of their diet in these belt. British, Pravir, Posto, yes. In Bengal, Posta will be becoming Posto. And BOP is balance of payment. I'll explain. See, what is balance of payment crisis? That means we are about to explain that. China used to sell but not purchase anything. That means China continued to remain as a sink of world bullion. That means gold from all across the world used to come to China. China was exporting majorly silk garments, also porcelain. Back then, Milton flasks were not available. Porcelains are useful for containment of warm liquids. So naturally, the rest of the European world heavily dependent on the Chinese exports. So hereby, British could not afford, because British was still in the belief of mercantilism, accumulation of gold. Thereby, they felt the necessity to grow opium and sell it to the Chinese youth. Within few decades, China entire youth became, or major chunk of the youth became addicted to opium. The Chinese government attempted to ban opium. For this purpose, the Europeans waged multiple wars, namely the first and the second opium war. So here, opium was cultivated in India. For example, the family of the Tagores, they became extremely rich with these opium cultivation. Also the Tatas, today Tata sells from anything between needle and helicopter. So the origin all for the lucrative trade of, or the cultivation of opium. Anyways, please write down the next point. Commercialization of agriculture, or COA, also got a boost during American Civil War as there was deficit in the availability of cotton in the international market. It was cultivated in India, especially the Deccan region, right? You do not need further clarity for this point. We will deal with this point in future. These are the steps behind the commercialization of agriculture, right? Or the causes or the platform behind the commercialization of agriculture. Now, basically for agricultural practice. Achha, by the way, what facilitated commercialization agriculture? You can write down as note. It can also be a part of your causes. Write down as note, often because of high land revenue demands. The farmers were forced to cultivate cash crops that could be easily sold in the market at higher prices. That means relatively higher prices. This is another major reason. Did you understand this? British land revenue requirements were already very high. That means you cannot pay the revenue with cultivating standard crops. You have to grow for, in this case, cotton. It has a lot of profit. Indigo, lot of profit. If you only cultivate that, you will be getting some amount of money in your pocket. That means you can pay the land revenue. That means indirectly you are forced to cultivate. With this, I will discuss two models. Number one model was the Europeans were purchasing the immovable property in India. Europeans used to come to the country. Achha, by the way, during under the Charter Act of 1813, it was decided that the Europeans were entitled to purchase immovable property. Now you understand that we have discussed under the Charter, the British commercial monopoly has been completely ended. Now anybody can come to India and do business. So they started buying property. By buying property, they need to have benefit as well. They became the indigo planters or different kind of plantation owners. Tea planters. So they used to purchase the land, purchase seeds and implements, different equipments for farming, and they used to hire labor and pay them for their salary. And they used to get the end product and sell it back to Europe, take it back to Europe. For example, indigo. 1833 Charter Act of 1833. See, indigo, it is a weight loss kind of an industry. For example, sugar, it is also a weight loss kind of an industry. For sugar cane, there's a lot of water weight. You extract the sugar, the syrup, and you boil it, and you take the sugar crystals. The lot of weight you have to carry less, and also sugarcane. They also ferment very easily, rot very easily. So you cannot carry it back to London. That means these industries were there in India. For indigo, you have to boil it, take the extract, the color, make it blocks, chunks, thereby bring down the water weight. Thereby these industries interestingly were there in India. Now this is a model. Another model is a lot of risk factor. That means the indigo planters had a lot of risk factors. So would they want to have this amount of risk? No. The most convenient model for them was they would prefer giving loans. For example, in Bengal, eastern part, it was known as Dadan. They would give the loan at a very high interest rate. Now, if you take the loan, because farmers desperately needed money, because they had to pay land revenue, meet their expenses. They were desperately needing money. Once you have taken money, you cannot pay back. You are into debt trap. That means you are forced to cultivate. This model was more popular. The exploitation was manifold. So these are the two models by which they used to cultivate indigo in India. Again, there are multiple provisions in multiple countries. You do not have to worry about it. Different countries, then again, you have to get history as your optional, or maybe do your own research, not for UPS. We'll move on to the next concept. We are learning about the different causes or the platform, and we have learned about the different steps. Then we'll learn about the impacts, the significance or the impact, right? The significance or impact. See, one of your students has given the term rack renting. It is very essential that you remember. These terms often come in handy in expressing yourself. These jargons, technical terms, they help you with limit your answer within the given word limit. It is very much encourageable behavior. We'll learn about the significance or impact. That means a critical examination of commercialization of agriculture, right? We'll look into the positive as well as the negative consequences. We will first write down about the negative consequences. Then there are certain silver linings, positive consequences. We'll deal with them, right? We'll deal with first the negative consequences of commercialization of agriculture. First point, please write down. Commercialization led to replacement of food crops with cash crops. As the cultivable land was limited, it often led to non-availability of food in the market, a leading cause behind famine. Did you understand the point? See, if you are cultivating cotton instead of wheat or rice, what will happen is that there is no food. That means a crisis might occur. One of the leading causes behind famine. Next, please write down COA. That means commercialization of agriculture connected the domestic market with the international counterpart. This often brought ruin to Indian farmers and contributed to famine. Did you understand the point? Suppose in the case of tomatoes right now, or a few weeks before, tomato was roughly more than 100 rupees a kg. Now the farmers could not produce it. There was a lot of losses probably. Now suppose there is a lot of bountiful production of tomatoes in Mexico and they are dumped in the Indian markets at 2 rupees a kg. So what will happen to the Indian farmers? They will be ruined forever. They will incapable in recovering their expenditures, their input costs. Thereby, they will be incapable in cultivating next year. That will lead to farmers' suicide, right? Next point, often COA led to degradation of soil, turning them fallow or turning them barren. In bracket, you can write down for the case of cultivation of indigo. If you cultivate, see, the major challenge of indigo was indigo and rice. Both were kharif crop. They were cultivated during monsoon. Either you cultivate indigo or you cultivate rice. You cannot cultivate both. And if you cultivate indigo, the soil nutrient will be taken away. Either you have to keep the land barren or uncultivated for 2 years for it to regain the health, or next year you would want to cultivate rice, it will not grow rice. That is the challenge. Next point, please write down, distress arising out of commercialization of agriculture became leading cause behind peasant revolts. For example, Indigo Rebellion and Deccan Riots. You have written enough negative consequences. We will write down silver lining under commercialization agriculture. That means positive consequences of commercialization of agriculture. Please put the heading accordingly. Write down. Not all the outcomes of commercialization were bad. Some of the positive consequences are as follows. Number one, commercialization led to advanced farming practices. The British started growing crops according to specific geoclimatic conditions that resulted in a regional specialization of crops on an efficient basis. I hope you can give the examples for the same. Places like Bengal for rice, places in Uttar Pradesh for sugarcane, for tea for Darjeeling and Assam, right? For cotton, that is Deccan region, Deccan Plateau. So all these regional specialization was an outcome for the same, right? Next point, please write down. Regional specialization promoted for interdependency that contributed to, next point, grievances, that means challenges. Grievances of the peasants assumed a national character and became one of the causes behind a rise of Indian nationalism. I hope you can understand. If one place is growing crop A and the crop is needed by region B, it will lead to gradual interdependence that contributed to modern rise of nationalism. Also, the peasant revolts and rebellions will be soon joining the forces of mainstream nationalism. That is a contributing factor. Next point, last but not the least, write down. Also, competition with the international market brought the best out of Indian agriculture. Indian, that is rather simple to understand. With competition, it will work towards efficiency. It is said that our farmers, just before the independence, their condition compared to the condition of the peasants right after independence were by far better. After independence, we preferred a socialist model on the basis of self-sustenance on domestic consumption. Our international ties were cut off. Thereby, our agriculture also paid the price. We will discuss in our post-independent classes. All right. That's it. We'll